Thank you all so much for coming to this fantastic day of debate. My name is Ella Whelan. I'm the assistant editor at Spiked, and I'm truly delighted to be chairing this final debate, The Hate Trap, Should We Be Free to Hate? And now, hate speech is so often described in terms of something that we should all be on board with banning. You know, it's the kind of speech that's Islamophobic, that's fascist, that's racist, that's extremely sexist, anti-Semitic, nasty stuff. And we're told that it would be better if this kind of speech was banned, because I think we can all agree it's not pleasant to have anything like that leveled against you. And it is being banned really quite frequently. There's been so many cases, I could make huge long lists over the last few years of incidents in which people or speeches or groups have been banned because they have infringed upon hate speech laws. So what is the problem? Why is it bad to, in effect, stop people being hurt, to stop horrible things being said? Why is that a negative thing? And obviously, it's no secret that Spiked, as a true believer in free speech, takes issue with any kind of speech being banned. But what the real point is once you start to ban a certain type of speech, whether that be extremely racist, hateful, truly hateful speech, or any kind of speech like that, it inevitably bleeds into different types of speech. And what we now find is that any kind of speech or conversation that sways from what is deemed to be morally correct or politically correct, if we want to use that term, can now be defined as hate speech. And so you have Christians being told that they have breached hate speech laws because they've been critical of gay marriage. We have secularists being told that they are being illegally hateful for criticizing religion. And so we're now at a point at which to be hateful, to say hateful things, is potentially illegal. And so is there a problem with that? And should we be free to hate? And to find out more about this and discuss this, I'm delighted to welcome a really great lineup of speakers to take us through this discussion, and I'll introduce them in the order that they're going to speak. And first, we have Paul Coleman. Paul is the Deputy Director of the ADF International, who are our partners for this event. And Paul is also the author of Censored, How European Hate Speech Laws Are Threatening Freedom of Speech, which is on sale if you want to come find me at the end. We're delighted to have Paul. Please welcome him here. Second, we have Mohammed Al-Hussaini, who is the Senior Fellow in Islamic Studies at the Westminster Institute. Mohammed recently defended Pastor McConnell, the preacher who described Islam as satanic. He defended his free speech in the public case there. And he is also, I must say, a remarkable Sean Noss Irish singer, and I'm delighted to have him here today. And then last but not least, we have Brendan O'Neill. Brendan is the editor at Spiked and is a lifelong defender of free speech, no ifs, no buts. Brendan has his selected essays, A Duty to Offend, which we also have on sale outside, and has many times been called offensive and hateful himself, and has stood the test. So please welcome Brendan. So each of our speakers, as with the last few sessions, will have around about 5 minutes to speak, and then I'm going to head out as soon as possible to the audience. So Paul, without further ado.
Thank you. And let me begin this session by recalling 3 pieces of news that have taken place in about the last week or so. So in the Netherlands, the politician Geert Wilders is once again being prosecuted for hate speech. In 2014, Wilders asked a room of supporters whether they wanted to have more or fewer Moroccans in their country, and the response of fewer was met with this response by Wilders. He replied, he said, "We're going to organize that." And he is now being prosecuted for hate speech for that sentence. Also this week, in Germany, a prosecution has been launched against Facebook and Mark Zuckerberg because a number of supposedly hateful posts appeared on Facebook and were not removed And the German authorities have said that Facebook has a duty to remove them and has now opened a criminal prosecution against Facebook. And lastly, in France, the politician and former minister Christine Boutin has been prosecuted by the Court of Appeals in Paris for hate speech for giving an interview a couple of years ago in which she criticized homosexuality and same-sex marriage. Now, believe it or not, I would consider this a pretty normal week in Europe. And that is because every year, the list of what we can and can't say gets smaller and smaller and smaller. And the reason for this shrinking dictionary is hate speech laws. That is, laws designed to criminally censor speech because the content of that speech is considered by the state to be hateful or any other synonym we can think of: insulting, offensive, extreme, and so forth. Now, all countries in Europe have these laws, and they expand in number and in scope every single year. And there are so many problems with these laws. The history of where they came from, their use and abuse across Europe, the trajectory they're on for the future. But in this short time now, I just want to focus on one of the problems of hate speech laws by simply asking the question, what is hate? Or to put it another way, how do we distinguish between unhateful free speech on the one hand and hateful criminal speech on the other hand? Now, you would think that the answer to that question should be obvious for those who are talking about banning what we can and can't say. But it's far from obvious. There are no clear dividing lines between hateful and illegal and unhateful and illegal. And the reason for that is because the concept of hate is entirely subjective, it is completely arbitrary, and it is always subject to change. It's like this shifting sand, always adapting and moving with the times. Crucially, it's moving at the will of those in power. So imagine this scenario. An opinion that you've once held for years was once promoted as virtuous. And you continue holding that opinion, but today that opinion is barely tolerated. And you have to be careful who you tell your opinion to. At some point in the near future, it will cross the line and be deemed criminally hateful speech. But you don't control this process. It's not like there's a public list of acceptable and unacceptable words. And even if there was, you wouldn't get to be the one who decided what's on that list. So your once heralded viewpoint has stayed exactly the same. The law has stayed exactly the same. But other people's opinions have changed around you. And now the police are at the door investigating a hate crime. Now, does that sound implausible? But it's exactly what's happening. For example, those who believe that marriage is the union of one man and one woman have seen their view move from normal to narrow-minded to hateful in about the last 5 years. Their view has stayed the same, and now others' views have changed, and it's not long, perhaps, until their view will be forbidden completely. So let me get back to the question, what is hate? Quite simply, it's what whoever those in power say it is. It's neither more nor less. And by design, it changes all the time without any of us knowing, controlling, or stopping it. And that makes the concept of hate speech such a dangerous tool for those in power, because they can shape it and mold it as they see fit. And to finish, I'll show you how this is happening with the government's current plans on counter-extremism. So the government are trying to introduce a counter-extremism strategy, and obviously the question has come up, what is extremism? And while giving evidence to a parliamentary subcommittee, here's how a junior Home Office minister explained it. She said, and I quote, "The whole counter-extremism strategy has been a strategy for all forms of extremism, future-proofed for future types of extremism that we cannot possibly imagine. The government is trying to legislate for extremism that we cannot possibly imagine. Well, what a terrifying thought. And that, in a nutshell, is everything that's wrong with the whole concept of policing hate or policing extremism or any other similar concept. And ultimately, none of us are safe. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you very much. I'm a clergyman on the panel, I'm a Muslim on the panel, so I think I'm not an expert in this particular field. I think I'm on a journey in respect to my understanding of this field, so I'm going to speak personally. As Ella, thank you very much for inviting me. Ella mentioned that I attended as a defense witness in the case of Pastor James McConnell last December, the Protestant Unionist preacher who was prosecuted for giving a sermon in his own church in which he described my religion as satanic and said that he wouldn't trust Muslims. It came as some of a surprise to some of these ultra-unionist brothers and sisters that I should come to defend their pastor, not least because I'm a Muslim, but even worse because I play Irish fiddle, sing Gaelic rebel songs and support Celtic. But I think what I'm concerned for in this whole discussion is that we foster what my colleagues, my Christian and Jewish colleagues, call the circle of virtue. In my professional life, I work for a Christian-based research institute that engages particularly issues around free and open and honest discussion around theological matters to do with Islamist extremism and also persecution of Christian and other minorities in the Muslim world. And I think what we're trying to foster is circle of virtue thinking so that we stand in solidarity with one another to promote the free discourse and what you might call better quality disagreement in society. And really just to say, with the greatest respect to Joshua and the other legal experts in the room, to the law to just kind of bug off in a sense, to say that there are, that in our society there is the three estates, the trois états, the three estates of government, of the crown, of the judiciary, and also of the people, of civil society, and to say this is civil society space, and to protect that space. At the same time, it's also affected me very directly and very personally. When I have spoken up as a Muslim academic about Islamist extremism and about the collusion of the Church of England hierarchy with some really dodgy UK-based, what you might call Islamists in suits, people who manage to kind of scrub up for the cameras, but have dodgy connections to extremist organizations abroad. To the Christians of the room, I'd say it was actually Christians. It was Lambeth Palace that came after me for being offensive in criticizing my own community. And it's been Methodists that have shouted me down. And in other contexts, being used to being chucked out of meetings, when I have criticized, for example, in my sort of charity work, criticized sort of the City of London officers for siphoning off money that's allocated to local communities for pet projects. The response has been that these statements by you have caused civil society city officers to feel undervalued. So in a sense, public officials and many others, we've kind of seen the movement from facts to feelings. And I'm under no illusion that those who harp on about freedom of speech, how in the past, in the 1950s, you could say racist things, you could say misogynist things, you could say homophobic things, anti-Semitic things. I'm under no illusions that there is a one-sidedness in some who advocate for freedom of speech. But nonetheless, what we're seeing, in a sense, as a result of equality, is the democratization of the right to be offended democratization of the right to be offended, so that anybody can express a subjective feeling of feeling threatened or feeling intimidated by somebody critiquing their lifestyle or their beliefs. And that's an extremely dangerous place indeed. In terms of the other side of my work, I work with survivors of abuse, and I was horrified to experience legal challenge, real legal threat, when I spoke publicly about Anglican clergy abuse, and that resulted in a response whereby the Anglican clergyman in question, there was 100% certainty about the truth of what I was saying, but because it caused distress and alarm to the perpetrator, it resulted in a legal challenge. So that's the kind of society we're moving to. At the same time, I would say that within religious traditions, there is an absolutely appalling track record when it comes to freedom of speech issues. We have the case of, during the lifetime of the Prophet, people poets like Ka'b bin Ashraf and Asma bint Marwan, who criticized him, being bumped off. Muslim apologists would say this was due to his companions acting out of enthusiasm without his say-so. At the same time, Christians have been just as culpable. In his Summa Theologia, Aquinas talks about how heretics aren't just to be punished in the hereafter, but are to be eliminated from the present earthly world. And the reformers aren't much better either. John Calvin burnt Michael Servetus, didn't he? So religious institutions, the boot is on the other foot in this current context, and we should be extremely careful about how we proceed. I think it affects people in their daily lives to the extent that an honest and frank conversation about the theological underpinnings of violent verses in the Quran, violent verses in Deuteronomy chapter 20, those theological discussions that are actually the bread and butter of my daily life in my academic work are now under threat, and this cannot be allowed to obtain in a society where we are desperately trying to deal with the global issues of religion gone wrong in the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. Brendan.
Thanks, Ella. Over the past few days, I've become grimly fascinated by the anti-Donald Trump protests in America, because they are so funny if you watch them or read about them. So you've got all these placards, people saying, white people are stupid, white people are evil, all of which are carried by white people. So you have this hilarious spectacle of self-hatred. You have someone carrying a placard saying Donald Trump is a fascist and doesn't respect democracy and free speech, next to someone else carrying a placard saying down with this election result. But my favorite placard of all of them, which was photographed and made its way around the press, was this message on one of the placards to Trump supporters, which said, "Your vote was a hate crime." And I just thought that was hilarious. I laughed at that as I did at everything else. But at the same time, it was also quite terrifying and chilling. And it wasn't just this one placard that actually chimes with a sentiment that has greeted the vote in America, which is this idea that the millions of people who voted for Trump were acting out of hate. The word you will see in most of the kind of angry newspaper coverage about what's happened is hate. They were acting out of hatred, as if millions of people wake up on election day and march to the ballot box with hate in their mind and hate in their hands and hate. I mean, that's literally how some commentators conceive of these people. And I thought this idea that even your vote, even the act of voting can be a hate crime, so it can be a hateful act and a criminal act, I thought was really interesting, because what it points to, I think, is the ever-expanding empire of hatred, the ever-expanding category of what is hateful. And, over the past few decades, really, we've gone from a situation where punching someone in the face on account of their racial background is a hate crime, to a situation where saying something mean to someone on the basis of their racial background is a hate crime, to a situation where criticizing gay marriage or criticizing Islam is a potential hate crime, it's hate speech, to now where going into a ballot box and expressing your deepest beliefs, your conscience, what you think in your heart and your mind, now that is a hate crime too. And I think it's really fascinating, almost uncontrollable expansion of the things that are defined as hateful and therefore as problematic in some way. And, if you just look at the way in which the word hate is used now, it's constantly attached to various things that people simply don't like. So there's, hate crime, of course, there's hate speech, there's hate groups, which is any group that has, dodgy ideas or even not so dodgy ideas. Hate newspapers. Currently there is a campaign to get advertisers to pull out of the Daily Mail, and it's presented as a campaign against hate newspapers. Now there are hate websites, and now there is hate voting. Voting itself can be a hateful thing. And what we have is a situation now where if you want to demonize something, if you want to delegitimize a group or an idea or a belief or a way of life, all you need to do is add the word hate at the start of it, and you're done. That's it. They're finished. And just to give an example of how this ever-expanding empire works and the terrifying impact it can have on freedom of speech, I was really struck that recently the Southern Poverty Law Center in the US, which is this group that, this kind of liberal group which kind of keeps a tab on all hate groups and decides through its wisdom what is a hate group and what isn't. And, it has neo-Nazis and racist groups and anti-Semites and various people who we can all agree are quite hateful. And recently it added to its list people like Maajid Nawaz, the British liberal critic of extreme Islam, Ayaan Ali Hirsi, the Somali-born critic of extreme Islam. They have now been added to the Southern Poverty Law Centre's lists of people who are, in its words, extremists and who promote hatred of Islam. And I think that is a real sign of how out of control and insatiable the empire of hate has become, and the way in which it encapsulates more and more, not even horrible ideas, not even particularly extreme ideas. If you read Maajid Nawaz or Ali Hirsi, these are eminently reasonable, intelligent, measured people have now been co-opted into this ever-expanding empire of hate. And I think, just to finish, I think the problem here is really that what's happening is that the term hate is being used quite instrumentally to pathologize and demonize any idea that any person, I don't think it even necessarily needs to be someone in power, that any person or group finds distasteful or problematic or difficult. And I think we should have no truck with it whatsoever. I think we now even need to move beyond the debate about what's hateful and what's not hateful, because that, I think, plays too much into the idea that there are certain ideas that should be unutterable in public life. We need to move beyond that debate and recognize that the term hate speech has no more legitimacy than the term thought crime. And when I hear someone talk about hate speech now, to me, I hear the word thought crime, because that phrase is used entirely to toxify certain ideas, to disease certain ideas, to present certain ideas and certain arguments and certain beliefs as deserving of punishment. And when you present certain ideas as deserving of punishment, I don't think you can be surprised when, as a consequence of that, you give rise to actual real-world agitation and real-world violence against people who are considered to be hateful, whether it's students who literally chase and scream and harass people who are pro-Israel, or whether it's extreme Islamists who will summarily execute people who commit hate speech acts against Islam. A society which has this ever-expanding empire of what's unsayable because it's allegedly hateful is a society that's going to generate intolerance and violence and, ironically, hatred.
Just before we go out to questions, I'm going to take my liberty as chair to put some, because we have a lot of agreement on this panel, which is fine. But what about if we bring it back to, I mean, we've talked about the ridiculous examples of hate speech laws being used, and we've talked about the ever-expanding nature of it. But what about, let's use the example of, during the Trump campaign, and the alt-right has been talked about previously today, there was some genuinely, and we can all agree, very hateful, extremely racist, extremely kind of discriminatory, horrendous things said. by certain factions of Trump's base. Are we saying that? I don't think we're saying, but are we in danger of saying that that's okay? That being that hateful is okay, or should we, as a society, be making a stand against that kind of level of hatred? Brendan, let me ask you first.
Yeah, I think even when it comes to things that most normal people can agree is hateful or racist or anti-Semitic, even then, there's no question that it should ever be censored. I think censorship is the worst tool imaginable for resolving racism or anti-Semitism or any other kind of ism, because all you do, if you censor those kind of things, you give them this kind of exotic allure, you make them seem dangerous and to some people perversely attractive, you make them more attractive than they otherwise would be. You also never have a reckoning with them and have the discussion out and prove that they are ridiculous and wrong and everything else, because you simply refuse to allow them to be expressed in public. So, in fact, it often backfires. If you look at France, for example, 25 years ago, France outlawed Holocaust denial. Now France has a really serious problem with Holocaust denial and with the new anti-Semitism. And I don't think those two things are unrelated. If you push something like Holocaust denial underground, where it can't be challenged and confronted in a public way, then you are going to allow it to fester. So even when it comes to horrendous ideas and speech, censorship is the wrong answer. I do, however, think that some of the criticism of Trump's use of language and some of Trump's supporters' use of language was slightly blown out of proportion. I mean, if you read some of the coverage, you think Trump was goose-stepping down the mall in Washington and saying, let's kill all black people. It was blown out of proportion. He did say some stupid things, but he's not Hitler.
Okay. And Mohammed, let me put the same thing to you, but let me add, in your work with, the kind of counter-terrorism and anti-extremism, is there something in that in relation to, incitement to hatred, which is often what's argued in relation to hate speech laws? Do you have a line, basically, what I'm asking is on, or should anything be said?
Well, I think in response, I'd say that I'm under no illusions about freedom of speech, freedom of expression, and indeed freedom of conscience. I don't think it's a nice thing. I don't think it's a bright thing. I don't think it's a wonderful, glorious thing. I think it's a pretty awful thing, but it's absolutely essential for our survival as a human species. So, for example, I will stand, and I did stand foursquare for Charlie Hebdo to publish and to stand alongside the Yellen Posten people in relation to their right to critique my religious tradition. I'm absolutely convicted of the rectitude of their right to be able to do that. At the same time, I'm not unaware, I'm not stupid, and I'm not unaware of the hypocrisies and the double standards that apply in relation to upholding the freedom to criticize a minority community at the same time as Danish laws prohibit defaming or discrediting the Danish crown. And those who talk about, the golden days of the 1950s when you could be racist and you could be homophobic and you could be, misogynist, what they're talking about is a very strong asymmetry of the right to be offended. So, for example, people who had less power could not be offended, and if you criticize the crown, you'd end up being locked up or worse. So there is no golden age, and this isn't a nice issue at all. We need to speak up for academic freedom and for the territory of civil society, because as Brendan says, it is in this territory that we can resolve these problems, not by weaponizing the judiciary as a tool to shut down debate, because the victims of that are far greater in number.
Thanks. And Paul, I mean, it's a new type of censorship that's happened, but there has always been, and you've talked about this before in your book, there's always been some level of censorship, and we're certainly not burning people at the stake anymore, thankfully. But what's new about this kind of, what's different about this new wave? Are we arguing for a new age in which there is no limitation on speech? Because actually, if you look back at history, there has always been some manner of check or balance on what people can say. Do you think there should just be absolutely no check on it?
I think in terms of the limit, we ought to be looking for a standard that is clearly understood, that we all know about, and we can foresee where that line is and know when we're going to cross it or not. And so the standard I argue for in the book, and I think makes sense, is drawing the line at incitement to imminent violence. And I think that is a clearly understood concept that we can all understand. The problem with incitement to hatred is it's too nebulous. It's too able to just shift and move. And so no one knows if they're inciting hatred or not, because no one knows what hatred is. And so I think there can be a line, but that doesn't mean to say that speech that falls short of that line, we can all just accept and think, oh, it's fine, isn't it wonderful to live in a society with all of this sort of speech? It just means that the burden is on us as citizens to engage with that, rather than calling the police. And I think the problem with hate speech laws is it makes us lazy, and it makes us just call the police and invoke state power and criminal law, rather than actually getting us off our chairs and doing something about it. And I think in the US, you had this case of Snyder versus Phelps, where you have this terrible mischaracterization of Christianity in the Westboro Baptist Church. And they go around picketing things just to make headlines, picketing funerals, picketing all sorts of things. They're the people with the signs that say God hates fags and thank God for dead soldiers and this sort of stuff. Now that would be banned in every country in Europe, but it wasn't banned in America. And what happened is, they would go and try and picket these funerals, and the citizens would get together and form human shields around the funeral, uniting pretty much all of society to stop these picketers getting anywhere near the funeral. It engaged the people, and it put a responsibility on the people to do something about it and to act, rather than just calling the police. And I think that's the direction that we should be going in here in Europe.
Brilliant. So let's see some hands from the audience, please. Brilliant. Let's start right at the back. There, in the glasses, yep.
Thank you. Hello. I'd just like to introduce myself. I'm one of the so-called Lambeth slaves. I mean, do I look like a slave? Okay. You know, I just want to take up what happened to us and the issue of who is propagating hatred. Who is the one propagating hatred among the people? You know, in our case, Aravindan Balakrishnan, okay, he was accused of the most heinous crimes, okay? It was all lies and fabrication. I should know it. I lived in his collective for 40 years. Now, for over 6 days, there was nothing but venom and vitriol being put through the media, the state-backed media, about Aravindan Balakrishnan and our collective. Okay? So I'm just posing the question, who is spreading hatred and venom among the people? You know, surely we have to focus properly as to who are the real ones who are behind hatred, you know, and happy that people, you know, are hating one another, because while people are hating one another, the state can continue, you know, taking away people's freedoms more and more.
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
Brilliant. Thanks.
All right, thank you.
And bring it down just there. This chap in the glasses. That.
Hi. I'm just thinking in terms of hate speech and the inconsistency of its application by its own advocates. So I think some examples that were in the regional press recently. It was just after the referendum, and there was a great act of post-Brexit hatred where it involved a moron waving at an Asian taxi driver saying bye, 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 bye. And there was a quote from the police that hate crime wouldn't be tolerated and they were looking into this matter. Meanwhile, when it came to the large-scale industrial child grooming, you know, the racial grooming, etc., and if you look at all the cases and all the horrendous language that comes out and all the horrendous abuse, and not once does these feature in the hate crime statistics. So it appears the hate crime statistics are being boosted by ignorant morons saying words, but not when there's industrial-scale racial grooming. And I just wondered, can anybody work out why the police adopt a double standard? If you actually looked on the police force's Twitter feed, inviting people to be, you know, aware of hate crime and to report it, and there was a whole stream of things underneath, well, what about racial grooming? Why doesn't this figure into it? no answers applied. So any thoughts on that one?
Brilliant, thank you. We'll take this lady here in the glasses there. Thank you.
Kerry Dingle from World Right. I'd just like to, on your point, Paul, because you said that, I think you were suggesting that insofar as there has been, you know, hatred and all the rest of it, without the law, we have been, historically, good at dealing with that and tough at dealing with that, and we've stood on our own 2 feet, more as resilient, robust, and political activists or whatever. But it would seem now we're incapable, and it's assumed incapable of dealing with those things. It isn't just that there is this outbreak of victimhood and vulnerability, there is, and crying offence at anything, but it would seem, and I think Brendan is absolutely right on this, that there is actually less hate than ever before, historically. So how can we explain, I'd love your comment, all of your comments, on why is there more of an obsession and expansion of the concept of hate at a time when there is less hate than ever before? And I'd just also like to ask, because it would also seem, and maybe you can say that I'm saying let's have more hate, and in some ways maybe I am, but it seems that there is in fact a complete failure of a clash of ideas and of argument. We've even heard today people saying, heal the division, heal the rifts. People are saying that about the election of Trump. People have been saying it post-referendum, etc. And I would say, actually, I think there's been too little. Bring it on. Because if we're serious about a more resilient and robust society, we should have more argument and deal with more bad ideas. And actually, there's been very few.
Thank you. Yeah. Just pass it there next to you. Yep.
In some ways, is there just too much emphasis on speech? And I guess it's the point, Brendan, you were making. So in some ways, when the Brexit vote happened, a lot of people who were trying to understand why people voted leave seemed to just be able to explain their actions in the realms of their Daily Mail readers, in which they've just got the wrong information, or in fact, obviously, we've seen today and over the last couple of days about Zuckerberg and Facebook, and the reason why people voted Trump was about them getting these false information on Facebook. And there doesn't seem to be any connection or understanding or about the depth of an individual and why all the other things and all the other reasons and all their other depth that they would vote in some ways. And there does seem to be an obsession with a certain section of the population that we are just determined by speech and the written word. So, I mean, just interesting what the panel think about that.
Thanks. I'm going to come back to the panel. We're going to go out several times more, so don't worry. Paul, can I start with anything you want to come back on?
Sure. Let me highlight the post-Brexit hate comment and just highlight one of the facets of hate speech laws which we've not yet touched on, but it's important, which is their arbitrary application. Earlier, Peter Tatchell mentioned that there are 9 protected characteristics under equality law. When it comes to incitement to hatred, there are even fewer. There are 3. You cannot incite religious hatred, you can't incite racial hatred, and you can't incite homophobic hatred. But presumably, on this basis, other forms of hatred are open season. And therefore, you end up with this completely arbitrary application of hate speech laws. And so you have all of this supposed rise in hate crime after the Brexit vote, with people committing all sorts of racial hatred against Poles and Romanians and others. But there was no attention paid at all to all the other type of hatred going on. And just earlier today, Simon sent me some of the tweets from post-Brexit, which I thought would be perfect to read out now, all targeted against old people. And so The Guardian had put out a question, how do we Guardian readers feel about Brexit? And then they got people to tweet their responses. I'll just read you a couple. One person said, "I'm going to say it. These 60-year-olds are going to die." Another one said, "I can't believe the old, racist, uneducated people who'll be dead in 10 years have ruined the country." And one more, apologize in advance for the language. It's all the oldies that voted out, so guess what? Won't be giving up my seat on the bus now, dickheads. Eye for an eye. Pretty ominous stuff. These things were retweeted thousands of times. But that was all totally fine. And it's like this Orwellian concept of hate, that we have to have our 2 minutes of hate directed in a very intentional place, and everything else is fine.
Mohammed.
I think the response to many of these debates is that the answer to bad speech is more speech and better speech. And it's about protecting the borders of civil society from the encroachment of authoritarian judiciary or indeed the Crown, from the space within which we can have that conversation and sort it out. At the same time, I'm very aware of the asymmetries of power, and the lady here quite rightly mentioned that we're in a better situation today than we've been in the past because of the greater levelling out. In the past, being offended was the privilege of only a few, and the ordinary masses had to cope with Jew hatred or with racism or with gender discrimination and all the rest of it. So we're actually seeing the democratization of the right to be offended. And that's, in a sense, it comes out of a positive development in society. So now we need to engage the realities of how, in a society where communities are far more in communication with one another than they have been in the past, this is inevitably leading to conflicts of equality versus freedoms of conscience. And in order to do that, we need to protect the liberty that obtains in civil society. At the same time, I would say that we also need to bear in mind that the kind of communities that are most vocal about coping around hate speech are those that have actually perpetrated the greatest hatred. So the religious communities, the established religion, and just to bring it back to the very first questioner, the Abrahamic religions have upheld the worship of the one God. Blessed be he, the God of Abraham. And they have set out moral codes for justice and equity in society. And at the same time, they have supported genocide and slavery and misogyny and unspeakable wrongdoing throughout history, and the re-emergence of Sharia edicts supporting a return to those categories of slavery and so on are an indication of how a beleaguered community that feels that it's being put upon re-engages its demands for ascendancy. So we need to be very careful about this whole football game. And just concluding on football, one of my Irish friends did talk about, he's an equalities officer for the government in Scotland. And there is this piece of legislation which I can never name correctly, which came out of the whole kind of Rangers Celtic thing, which is called I believe the offensive behaviour and intimidating conduct at football matches (Scotland 2012), and it's just been a complete disaster from the outset. So to be able to sing the Billy Boys, which is an appalling song, within a football stadium is deeply criminalised, whereas outside it's not, and it kind of creates all these kind of legal nonsenses that we need to address. So I think it really comes down to the view that the judiciary need to be stopped in their tracks when it comes to encroaching upon public conversation. More speech, better speech.
Yeah, I think just following on from Paul's point, I think the problem with hate speech laws is not simply that there are double standards and some people are punished under them and others aren't. Hate speech laws actually sanction hatred. I mean, they promote hatred because what they implicitly say or explicitly say is there are some people whose views are so intolerant that you should not tolerate them. And therefore, why don't you shut them up? Why don't you punch them? Why don't you try and get them out of your workplace or your university? This is what hate speech laws implicitly communicate. And so if you look at modern Britain, for example, you know, we talk, and Paul writes fantastically in his book, which I highly recommend, about all the supposedly hateful things you're not allowed to say. But we also need to realize that there are lots of hateful things you are allowed to say. There are lots of groups you are allowed to be hateful about. Old people is a very good example. Football fans is another example. You can read the most obnoxious commentary about football fans in mainstream newspapers. Working class people, especially ones who vote Leave. The commentary I've read about them is deeply disturbing. If you read it about any other group in society, there would be a court case the next day. Christians, you can be extremely mean about Christians. And the reason you can be mean about those sections of society is because they are considered to be intolerant. So Christians are considered to be intolerant of gay marriage, for example. Football fans are considered to be intolerant because they make very un-PC chants and they sing the Billy Boys. Old people are presumed to be intolerant because they tend to have right-wing views or they don't like the European Union. So the hate speech empire says you may hate them, and in fact you should, because that's your duty in a world in which we want to exterminate hate. It's this extremely Kafkaesque situation. So hate speech laws actually sanction the hatred of groups in society. I think, just coming on from Kerry Dingle's point about why there's this obsession with hatred when there's far less of it than ever before, I think that's fascinating. This is one of the reasons I spend my whole life in a state of utter disappointment and fury with the left. Because, you know, in the 80s and the 90s, when racism was a serious problem in Britain, the left tended not to say very much about it. You know, they had their anti-Nazi movements, which just focused on 7 skinheads at the end of the road. But they didn't talk about real racism institutionalized throughout society. They kind of thought that was a bit of a distraction from, you know, demanding a higher wage or something. Now, when there is far less racism than ever before, society gets on with it. We all get on with each other far better than ever before. They're obsessed with hatred and they see it everywhere and they go trawling for it even where it doesn't exist. Because anti-hatred and supposed anti-racism are new means of social control. They are new means of controlling what people can think, what people can say, and even how we interact with each other, even how we speak with each other. So I think you should be deeply skeptical of anyone who in 2016 claims to be an anti-racist, especially if they weren't one in 1987. Because what they are doing, they are actually seeking to demonize certain sections of society and control how we interact with each other, not promote tolerance.
Can I just add on? And just to piggyback on that thought, I think that you know, the idea of rising hate creates more power for the two groups. It creates more power for the state because there's an increased problem that they have to solve. And the greater the problem, the more powers they need to solve it. And it creates more power to the interest groups because they're the victims. And in a culture of identity politics, the more that they are victimized, the more power they need to be given. And so I think we end up with more and more hatred, supposedly, in our society because of power for the state and power for the victims.
Okay. Microphones, can we come to this young fella in the middle with the glasses there?
You know, if you describe everyone by their characteristics, you're on thin ice there.
You've triggered me. Hello? Yeah, I'm triggered. Thank you. It's become very difficult to have a civil conversation, a better quality of disagreement, as you said so well earlier on, about hate speech. I think a lot of this is because a huge proportion of the kind of leftist liberal elite have stopped making the distinction between ideology and people. We start seeing this in the term Islamophobia, for example, you know, a word invented by the Muslim Brotherhood with the explicit intention of aligning criticism of scripture with that of individuals. We see it in Hillary Clinton's dismissal of Trump voters as a basket of deplorables, and as you said, Brendan, in the Southern Poverty Law Centre's deeming of Ayaan Hirsi Ali as an anti-Muslim extremist. So my question is, do you have any ideas on how we're going to have more productive conversations with these people, or is it a completely lost cause?
Okay, thanks. If you actually pass it along, this lady just in front of you, there.
Thank you. Paul Coleman, I wonder if there is such a bright line, as you say, that everybody clearly understands what incitement is. Because if you look at historical contexts of the preparation for incitement, the step before, for example, the broadcasts on the radio, which led to the whole Hutu, the whole genocide, where people were referred to as cockroaches, the same kind of dehumanization that took place in Nazi Germany. You first start with the dehumanization so that the killing becomes easier. But the problem there is that it's usually state actors who use those kind of tactics. So in that case, any kind of civic legislation against it wouldn't even be an issue. It wouldn't be effective. So my question is, do you think in any civil society, not talking about state actors in those circumstances, there is an arena or an area, a step before that, which is preparation for incitement to violence?
Thank you. Let's have this lady right here at the front.
Thank you. I thought it was interesting the point you just made, Paul, about it gives power to the state and to the victims, because I don't see any power going to any victims as it happens. And I think for me, it just seems to be a telling off. That's what we get. And it's really as if you're in the school playground. Don't say that, it's naughty. Don't say that, it's naughty. And it's only in the end, it is the authorities that get the power. And it really discourages it's encouraging us to behave like children and to react like children in this kind of throwing hate, rather than actually having any kind of reasoned discussion and debate. And I think the point that was made behind me about it just being the surface that's always looked at, and not any kind of deep understanding of any discussion or any motivation of anything. We're all just turned into children.
Yep.
Thank you. And let's take the gentleman here on the edge of the aisle. You ready?
Yeah. It's been touched on already, but I feel I need a deeper explanation about the most remarkable lack of self-awareness there is. One thing that has been mentioned is there was a lot of complaints in the presidential election about voter exclusion. Very tough to get to vote in America for certain minorities, and certain laws were brought in, identify ID and etc. And yet, the same people who were saying that were suggesting that the over 60s shouldn't have voted in Brexit. You had, rather correctly, Trump being accused of disrespecting women, not without justification, I must say. And when you ask them, well, what do you think we should do? And the answer would be, well, put Hillary and Bill Clinton back in the White House. And Bill Clinton's not exactly the greatest respect of women I could mention. And I think the final one was Trump accusing Mexicans of being rapists. Mm. And yet, during the papal visit, where the enemies of the state and throughout the United States, there was absolutely no compunction of accusing Hispanic Catholic priests of being child rapists. But the same people were complaining about Mexicans being... What would you explain this ridiculous lack of self-awareness?
Okay, thank you. I'm going to take one more lady just directly behind you in the green jacket.
One of the things that's quite confusing is that because it looks like it's about words and language, we tend to think it's about the meaning of those words and language. And actually, thinking about this, I don't think it's got anything to do with the actual content of those words themselves. I mean, I don't think it's as arbitrary as you say it is, but that's not because of the way in which the problematic words are identified. It's because of the people who utter them are being identified in that way. And it makes me think this is actually just a way of segregating people. through the language that they speak, without actually putting us in boxes and preventing us from directly interacting with one another. Because, and you know, I know if I speak to my mother, she feels very inhibited because she doesn't know whether to say coloured or black or, and she's doing that herself. And it's not because she's ever encountered somebody who's tried to enforce the right language, but she kind of knows it's out there. And probably I used to beat her over the head with that kind of stuff. So it's that actually you end up with this self-segregation from all parties, and not just the people who think they're under attack from people outside, but actually from the people who identify themselves as potentially attackers. But language is just the tool through which this happens.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Let's come back to the panel. Brendan.
Yeah, on the question of how can we improve public debate, I think it's quite simple, actually. We just need more freedom of speech. And I think we sometimes underestimate what a profound impact that would likely have on the standard of public discussion. Because as Paul was saying earlier, the great thing about freedom of speech is not necessarily what people are going to say with it, that's kind of immaterial in some ways, is the fact that it invites us to behave as actual citizens. It invites us to be morally autonomous adults. And it invites us to take ourselves seriously, to take ideas seriously, to keep in check things that we think are racist, to engage in society in a real way. Whereas censorship infantilizes us. Censorship treats us as children. Censorship says, you don't have to worry about what is right and wrong, because we've decided for you. And I think we sometimes underestimate what impact that has on people. If you are no longer required to decide for yourself what is right and wrong, then you are not really a full citizen, or even really a full human being, because you've been kind of pacified and put out to pasture and just allocated this very childlike role. I think if we were to have complete freedom of speech, no bans whatsoever on Holocaust denial or racism or anything at all, then the immense responsibility people would feel to engage in society would improve, I think. And through that, you could well see a flourishing of different ways of thinking, different ideas. People would have to come up with new manifestos to challenge this and new ways of challenging that. And I think that would enliven and enlighten public debate in a very real way. So I think that's the first and most important step. We need to get rid of all censorship. Following on from that, the question of what kind of censorship is most problematic, and the question in the front row made me think about this in terms of what hate speech laws do. Do they help victims, or do they just tell people off? My real concern is not with I'm terrified by the way laws are used to punish priests for criticizing homosexuals, or Brigitte Bardot for saying that the way Muslims slaughter meat is barbaric. She's actually been fined for saying that. All of that stuff is terrible. But even more worrying than that is the impact it has outside of the law in everyday society, the chilling effect it has in terms of people self-censoring themselves. There's this Iraqi poet, and her poetry has been banned in Iraq a number of times, and she recently made this comment where she said, she now lives in America, and she said, in Iraq, censorship is explicit and it follows speech. In America, censorship is implicit and it precedes speech. And I think that is a really useful description of the kind of regimes we're living under today, which is not explicit speech, explicit censorship that punishes the book or burns the book that's already published. It's much more implicit, and we censor ourselves. We simply don't say it. And if you read any interviews with Trump voters, you will see this. There's a fantastic piece in the Washington Post yesterday, interviews with Trump voters, and they talk about things they can't say. One of them uses the phrase, I've been PC shamed in not saying certain things. And so the only place they can really express themselves is in the ballot box, in that kind of private space which is entirely anonymous. That's the only place where they can be honest and say, I want Trump, or I want Brexit, or I want the Tories. Things they can't say in society itself. That's how shrunken the parameters of acceptable thought have become. So I'm worried about the way in which the whole empire of hate speech, not simply the laws, but kind of beyond that, has this chilling effect that we sometimes don't recognize, where people actually become almost dishonest, and public debate as a consequence suffers terribly, I think.
Thank you. Mohammed.
I would say that I'm on a journey in my understanding as a lay person in this field, of the parameters, the lines, if you like, of free speech. And certainly in counterterrorism context, certainly the line has always been the imminence of violence, the imminence of actual violence. At the same time, you know, I think as a clergyman, I'm going to have to say this, that the relationship is very important. Pastor McConnell's speech did not in any way, I think the prosecution were very clear, did not in any way incite to violence, but rather in his statements about the Catholic Church, you know, caused unhappiness that led to a Catholic priest, Father Pat McCafferty, approaching him, having a great big barney, and then out of that developing a 20-year relationship. And likewise, my engagement with him has meant that we've actually become full friends. We have cake. We have cake together, you know? And because it's Austria, we don't have gay cake, we only have Protestant cake, but it's still cake. It's still cake. And through that relationship, we're able to engage a strengthening of civil society institutions. And I think part of the frustration that's being expressed around this is our civil society institutions have been co-opted. The outrage and the Occupy process in which I was sort of a participant, involved, you know, come out of the sense in which our civil society institutions are being co-opted and undermined by state actors. And it's actually a case of not just giving us the legal tools to express ourselves freely, but also giving us the practical means through civil society to strengthen that public debate. In relation to what Avril said about language that is preparatory to violence, as I say, I'm on a journey, and I don't think, with the greatest respect to my distinguished colleagues, I don't think that we want to get into a society where it's okay to say, as we have for centuries, that Jews poison wells, or that the Jewish faith commends the killing of Gentile children in order to use their blood in the Pesach matzah. I have a real problem with that. And the question of whether that ought to continue to be very firmly protected through our legislature and through our judiciary against those kind of things happening as preparatory to pogroms, as preparatory to genocide. That's a question that I think Rwandans need to think about, and Bosnians and those from the former Yugoslavia need to think about, and we need to think about as well. So I just have to sort of declare my lack of clarity and my deep guttural discomfort about it. As a result of the Pastor McConnell case, I was approached by the lawyers of Anjem Chowdhury to come and defend his right to say things. And I felt like a total hypocrite when I chickened out about it, I have to confess, because I'm just not clear about these things. There are certain things that are guttural and certain things that are thought through. So I think I would confess to you all that my own position on this is still one of being a student and of learning about these things. I would, however, say that there is a deep concern about the realities of what I face with colleagues and friends. I referred to the City of London Corporation, a powerful institution, and how a pensioner, a female pensioner, she posted on her Facebook, after years of neglect by the City Corporation in relation to housing and repairs, you know, the little lad, the 20-year-old sort of lad who's the estate officer, deserves a clip round the ear. It's an idiom. It's an idiom that we all use. And she was hauled up and threatened with police action. So that's the kind of society that we're living in. And indeed, there is this kind of preemptive self-censorship that's going on. So it's deeply concerning.
Thank you.
Such a polite debate where every comment is applauded. I feel so edified up here. Mohammed, you mentioned 3 examples from history, and one was mentioned from the floor. And so I'm going to attempt to talk about each of those very briefly: Rwanda, Nazi Germany, and Yugoslavia, because I think it's important to see some of this historical context. So first of all, Rwanda. It's quite a common example that often comes up, but we have to look at the detail. It was a lot more than just name-calling as cockroaches. And I read you a quote from someone who investigated the whole Rwandan genocide. They said that the radio show in question quote, played the role of an army general rather than the traditional role of the media. That is to say, they provided well-targeted, practical information on how to kill the opposition and giving out the names and locations of those who were deemed to be targeted. That's very different to some of the things we're talking about. What they did, what this radio station Rwanda did, is incitement to imminent violence. Well, that's exactly the point, and incitement to imminent violence should be banned. Looking at some of these other examples, Yugoslavia and Nazi Germany, well, the fact is, in Nazi Germany, and you mentioned some of the blood libel examples, there were hate speech laws in the Weimar Republic, and these laws were used against the people who made the comments that you just said. And they were not effective. They created these show trials that created a platform for the Nazis to appear themselves as the victims and to further their message. And you could say if there was ever a time in history to argue for hate speech laws, it would be pre-Nazi Germany. That's the time that if ever there was a chance to use them and to stop hatred and evil, that was the time. And yet, they had them, and they did nothing to stop the violence that followed. And the exact same situation in Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia had some of the most stringent hate speech laws in Europe at the time, and those laws proved completely ineffective at stopping the ethnic cleansing that took place. So I think with these historical examples, Rwanda, Yugoslavia, Nazi Germany, we have to look at the detail, and I think when we do, we see that rather than provide evidence for hate speech laws, they do just the opposite.
You often find is that you get to a situation where, you know, people who are agitated by free speech or unsure about free speech find themselves in a position where they're effectively saying there was too much free speech in Nazi Germany. I mean, that's the avenue they go down. If only they had more censorship, then maybe they wouldn't have gone so crazy and killed so many people. And of course, Nazi Germany, Paul's point is absolutely right, that there were hate speech laws prior to the rise of the Nazis anyway, which were used against them ineffectively. But also the problem in Nazi Germany was explicitly one of authoritarianism and censorship, where political groups couldn't organize, Bolsheviks couldn't organize, Jews couldn't publish things or form political parties or then do anything at all. That surely proves the case that the only guard against that kind of tyranny is freedom of speech. But often you encounter people who are anti-freedom of speech who get themselves into the mess of arguing that if only there'd been more censorship in Nazi Germany, maybe so many people wouldn't have died.
Okay, thank you. I'm taking three last people from the floor, so really wave at me if you're really desperate. And then the panel will have 1 minute, absolutely 1 minute, to sum up. So let's start directly at the very, very, very back, right by the doors.
I thought you were going to describe me there now. One of the things that I was thinking, I think it was Paul, you said something about a hate law and a government saying it's about what we might do, and it made me think about all the things around workplace everywhere where actually the law is not really the responsibility of the so-called hater, because I can say something to my colleague and somebody overhears it and they say, oh well, that's bad, that's a hate law. So it makes me think that actually it's not about our agency. And then it made me think, last thing, made me think about what really is new now, what's really driving this. And one of the things, to me, is that now society is just really structured and values highest safety. So it's all about our safety. Meanwhile, it says that us humans, all of us, are just vulnerable to start off with. That's the kernel, that's our essence. So if you put those two together, we have a problem, but what would others say about what would be the main driver? What's new today?
Thank you. Bring the mic right down to the very, very front here, all the way down. And the second mic can go there afterwards. This gentleman beside up.
Hi. There is one area that I think really does need control, and that's in schools where teachers, and sorry, dare I say it, Muslim and Jewish schools and Catholic schools probably, where teachers describe homosexuality as an abomination. I think there was a few years ago, there was a head teacher of a Muslim school who went on radio saying that in an ideal world, homosexuals should be put to death. And I really am concerned about the welfare of children in those schools who are hearing that message and haven't got anyone to turn to, probably not sympathetic parents, nobody in the school who is going to counsel them if they're in a very close-knit community. What do you do about that?
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much. I think I'm going to make one small point. The elephant in the room all day has been the fact that no one has been prepared to say that many of us are afraid of radical Islam in this country. There has been very little. I don't see many Muslims in the room. I think we're really frightened, and I'm glad that I've got the freedom and the space to say this in the room. And thank you very much, panel. It's been a great day, but I'm really concerned about that.
All right, sir. Thanks. Panel, very, very quick, and your summing up thoughts. Can we start with you, Paul?
Three eclectic thoughts. I'm trying to think of a way to string them all together. I'll take Viv's point, I think. What's the driver behind all of this? And I think that Viv rightly says that the valuing safety is certainly very high up there, that we value our safe spaces, we want to be protected, we don't want to be offended at all costs. But I think there are some other drivers as well, and I think one of the main drivers is the idea that we can't be heard unless we are a victim of some sort. And so I come back to this idea of power, that people are using it as a card by which they can gain access and gain certain benefits. And I think this was commented on earlier, this sort of the spreading of phobias is just so dangerous because we all want our protection and the phobia that applies to us, and then we use that as a means of gaining power. And so we have Islamophobia, we have homophobia, we have transphobia, and I'm a Christian and was in a conversation with some fellow Christians who were saying, look, we need to coin the phrase Christianophobia. I was like, I mean, aside from the fact it doesn't exactly roll off the tongue, I think that is the exact problem. I said, no, we really don't want to go down that route of identifying ourselves as victims. And the lady said to me, no, we do need to do that because it's the only way we'll get a seat at the table. And I think it was really telling that is the approach behind a lot of this, that it's the only way we get a seat at the table is to become a victim. And the only way, I think, we will end it is by calling out some of these things and defending freedom of speech, being prepared to be offended, and removing safety blankets.
Thank you, Paul.
Thank you. I just want to thank the last gentleman for raising the issue of the elephant in the room. I did chuck it out, and I know I was hoping I would get some very frank questions in relation to Islam and particularly sort of the theological underpinnings of radicalism in Islam. I have, if you particularly want to Google me, I've written quite a lot about stuff, and also as a result of publishing an article in the Irish Times in support of Pastor McConnell's right to criticise my religion, the consequence was I was put on a blacklist. Along with Anders Breivik and the French Front National and various other people as an Islamophobe, the first Muslim imam Islamophobe. So that's kind of the consequences, and it didn't come from Muslims. It came from a kind of, if you like, a white liberal enlightened elite approach. So that's the reality on the ground. I would say very simply, I don't want to take too much time, but I deeply resent the racism of low expectations that characterizes me either as entirely a perpetrator or entirely as a victim, when the reality is that I and my people are both, as indeed you all are. And so out of this relationship, and you know, it comes down to that, out of conversation, out of protecting the boundaries of civil society, engaging a relationship between two men who care deeply about spiritual matters, and talking and discussing, we have come to a understanding of the need for reciprocal pluralism reciprocal pluralism, which means that we cannot be building mosques here while we allow churches to burn over there. And Muslims have to take their stand alongside Christians and others in civil society in defense of the religious freedoms of us all. We're not victims, we're not perpetrators, we're both. And really, if that's a message that we can foster through protecting civil society and protecting the freedom of academic and religious discourse, including the right to criticize religion, then that's a good thing that we'll have achieved out of today. Thank you.
Yeah, I think we need to face up to the fact and do something about the fact that we live in a society that openly polices emotion and which polices how we feel, how we think, and what we say. That is a terrifying prospect and needs to be confronted head on. You know, not only through the policing of hatred with hate speech laws and preemptive self-censorship in relation to hatred, also in relation to anger management, which is a booming industry. It's used on students who are considered to be too angry. It's used on prisoners. It's become this kind of institution. Also, the way in which certain ideas are redefined as disorders of some description. There's a new disorder, intermittent explosive disorder, which is basically someone who gets very angry sometimes. And then, of course, there's the way in which, as Paul says, all these things are redefined as phobias. You know, if you are critical of transgenderism, you are transphobic. If you are critical of aspects of Islam, you're Islamophobic, and so on. Of course, a phobia is an irrational fear. It's a mental instability. And, you know, if you look back in history, the kind of regimes that redefined certain ways of thinking as mental disorders were places like the Soviet Union. And that's obviously what happens in 1984, when our hero, Winston Smith, has been interrogated by O'Brien, and O'Brien says to him, "You are ill, you are mentally deranged, and we will fix you." That's now what society says to us. It polices how we feel about things. So I think we need to defend freedom of speech, defend the freedom of thought, and defend the right to be angry, to rage against things, and to hate things. I want to make a little defense of hatred. There's loads of things I hate. And hate sometimes gets me up in the morning. And, you know, this new slogan in America, "Love trumps hate." No, that is not true. Hatred throughout history has been a motivating factor for change. People hate their living conditions, they hate their governments, they hate the predicament they find themselves in. If we throw hatred out, then we're going to get into trouble.